How would you say a developing nation successfully transitions into a developed status?
Only one economy in the world has made that transition successfully.
A lot of African countries are enormously rich in resources, but they still do not have the elevated level of governance or prosperity.
Developing countries are said to have less than good governance. Many of the African economies have been impoverished despite their mineral wealth because they subjected themselves to this good governance criteria.
Would you say there's an optimal developmental model for smaller emerging markets?
You will find that they have very little to do with the need for capital.
Foreign aid has not been particularly useful in helping some of these countries to prop up their development because it's often guzzled by state leaders.
Aid has been abused like anything for decades and decades.
All right, Professor Jomo, welcome to the Innovation Civilization podcast. What a great pleasure to have you here today.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, Wahid.
Brilliant. Professor, let's dive into talking about, I guess, economies, right? Because that's your specialization. So there's obviously the concept of developed economies, and then there's developing economies, right? So how would you say like a developing nation successfully transitions into a developed status? Is it simply about like just GDP growth, or is there more that's to it basically? Like how would you sort of define that transition really?
Well, there are many ways in which people can do so, and there is no real consensus. I think for many development economists, uh, they would argue that probably only one economy in the world has actually made the transition successfully, referring to the Republic of Korea or South Korea, to move from developing country status to a developed country status. Of course, many people would argue that incomes in Singapore are very high, but most people do not consider Singapore to be a developing economy in the sense that it is essentially a city-state, and it's like talking about Genoa or Firenze, Florence or Venice as city-states, and then making generalizations about entire national economies on that basis. So I think the only undisputed case would be that of Korea, and I would argue that that has been achieved largely due to various specific conditions. Now, undoubtedly, there are some economies where there are developing economies have been able to achieve very high uh, average incomes,
Hmm.
and those average incomes are very high for a variety of reasons, sometimes due to mineral wealth. So the Gulf states, for example, have very high income, but that would also be true of, let us say, Norway today. And similarly, one could say that incomes have gone up significantly in some economies. For example, Equatorial Guinea used to be considered very, very poor, and now it's a very high income economy. But very few people would insist that it is a developed economy in the sense that the capabilities of the population of Equatorial Guinea are considered to be fairly developed, and that if not for the high mineral rents from oil in this case, they would be able to have those kinds of high incomes. So, but incomes have been a very crude indicator, favored very much by the World Bank, which has a category of high income countries, middle income countries, and low income countries. And then in the middle income category, it has upper middle income and lower middle income categories. But that is a income classification rather than a classification based on the skills or the abilities or capabilities of the human population.
Yeah, the concept of the natural resource is a quite an interesting one. I mean, we know the concept of the Dutch disease basically as well, right? But a lot of the African countries are enormously rich in like resources, but they still do not have the kind of elevated level of governance or like prosperity that you see in the rest of the GCC countries, for example, right? So I guess what I'm trying to understand is it just purely about income, or is there like more stuff that goes onto that picture, basically about good governance or institutions and so on and so forth?
That's a very good point you raise, Wahid. If you look at the governance indicators
Mm,
which are used normally, very often the argument about the relationship of governance to incomes is almost a tautological argument, meaning that one explains the other and the other explains the first question. So you will find that almost by definition, developing countries are said to have less than good governance. And developed countries are said to have good governance. But what are the criteria? The criteria are those which are used to define developed countries. So it's not a surprise that you have this kind of simple equation. In fact, I would argue that many of the African economies have suffered, have been impoverished
mm,
despite their mineral wealth, precisely because they subjected themselves to this so-called good governance criteria. Let me give you a simple example from the late 20th century. At that time, Tanzania, which was and still is one of the low-income countries in the world, according to the World Bank, Tanzania discovered gold deposits. And today, Tanzania is the third largest producer of gold in Africa, after South Africa as well as Ghana. Yet, the majority of people in Tanzania remain very poor. Uh, why is this the case? Because the World Bank advised Tanzania not to collect taxes from the gold mining companies. The gold mining companies was told, and the Tanzanian government seemed to have accepted this advice. They were told that if money came into the country and that money was taxed, this would result in corruption in Tanzania. So, because there was a possibility that Tanzania could become corrupt, therefore they were told not to tax. And so the result of this is that we now have gold mining companies um, operating in Tanzania very, very profitably, but they are subsidized by infrastructure provided by the Tanzanian government, in other words, provided by the Tanzanian taxpayers. Okay, so you have a situation there where there was a possibility that Tanzanians could become better off, but that possibility was blocked off by not collecting taxes from the gold mining companies. Now, to varying degrees, this has happened all over the world. Uh, uh, Two colleagues, Leon Ndikumana, who used to be the chief economist of the African development, and his co-author have written books on Africa, showing how this kind of wealth, which was and still is available in Africa, has largely left many African countries, precisely because they allowed foreign direct investment, but to basically dominate, and basically that foreign direct investment has hardly been taxed. Now, if you look, I mentioned earlier that Korea is one of the few countries in the world where taxation, where foreign direct investment has been played a very small role. Korean industry developed from very, very primitive manufacturing 6, 7 decades ago. And now you have some of the most sophisticated manufacturing in the world taking place in Korea. This has all been done by Korean companies. The big companies are known as jaebols. And this has been possible precisely because they have restricted the role of foreign companies. This has come about due to various uh, policies which were introduced at different times. But the fact of the matter remains that the Northeast Asian economies, namely Japan, Korea, and arguably even Taiwan province of China, have basically limited the role of foreign direct investment. In the case of the People's Republic of China, we find that foreign direct investment was invited in, but under fairly strict conditions. And hence it was Chinese companies were able to develop their own capacities and capabilities, and now they have overtaken some of these foreign companies and developed their own capacities and capabilities. A very simple example would be, say the electric vehicles. They were very friendly and remain very friendly to Elon Musk and Tesla still produces in China. But Chinese electric vehicles are very, very competitive and used more widely than say Tesla, because Tesla is a very, very expensive product. And one could say the same thing of quite a number of other areas. 5G, as you know, was developed by a Chinese company, Huawei. And there are a whole number of other areas where Chinese companies have been able to do this. Now, at an earlier period, the same thing could be said about Japanese companies. In the 1970s, I'm much older than both of you, and so in those days, there were books written being in the 1980s, Japan as number one. And it was only by imposing policies on Japan to have a very strong yen from 1985. Yes, from 1985, after the second meeting at the Plaza Hotel in New York. That policy basically meant that Japanese products became so expensive, uh, and it was very tempting for Japan, with a strong currency, to import things from abroad rather than produce themselves. So the Japanese economic miracle came to an end, and to make things worse, Japan undertook what was called a big bang, and the whole financial system, which had been painstakingly built up in the post-war years, came asunder. So Japan is no longer the kind of economic power
Yeah.
once threatened to become.
So I guess a few things here. So firstly, you mentioned about FDI, right? Whether you have FDI or not is not a straight cut answer to development, right? So it's more about how you use those foreign direct investments into building up the local infrastructure and the local companies, right? So is that what you're sort of saying? There's no like one panacea when it comes to FDI?
Yes, I would say that is generally true. There are some important exceptions,
Hmm.
and the most important exception probably is Singapore.
Hmm.
Singapore has taken a policy, an approach of promoting FDI and privileging FDI over domestic investments. And the result of this is that you cannot think of any single product, for example, which a Singapore company produces, which is internationally you know, which is very well known internationally. There is actually one product called the Sound Card, which was introduced, I think, 3 or 4 decades ago. But there's been nothing else since then. And it's not because Singapore doesn't do a lot in terms of technology. It does a lot in terms of engineering, education, and so on. But it prefers to serve foreign direct investments. This has its roots partly in the kind of strategy Singapore adopted, because it was very unsure whether its independence would be respected after it left Malaysia. And so they were very concerned, and they wanted foreign direct investment to have a strong role in Singapore, not for economic reasons alone, but for political reasons, so that the foreign companies such as the US and Japan would be strongly invested in ensuring that Singapore would develop strongly.
Prof, if you can touch a little bit on FDI and domestic direct investment. You mentioned several countries there: South Korea, Japan, Singapore, China. But these are typically countries that have got the economic capacity to actually invest locally if they decide to, particularly China, Japan. But we're looking at situations where there are also other methods of financing nowadays. You're talking about venture capital firms being involved, private equity firms, more innovative financing that's not typically available 20, 30 years ago. And when we talk about investing domestically, would you say there's an optimal developmental model for smaller emerging markets? Because what's typically we have observed would be that leaders of emerging economies will go around on FDI tour because they still believe that the FDI method is still the most or the easiest way of attracting investments and growing the economy. While your argument is that it's better for you to domestically invest and create a capacity yourself so that you can be the ones producing rather than relying on foreign brands. What say you, Prof?
I quite agree with the points you've made. I think it is true that, for example, in Southeast Asia, that has tended to be the case. More so in countries like Singapore and especially Malaysia, rather than even, say, Thailand or even Indonesia. If you look at, for example, Indonesia's innovations, such as biodiesel, nickel processing, and what do you call it, plywood manufacturing, and so on and so forth. All these developments in Indonesia were achieved precisely by domestic capital. There was nothing they really wanted from foreign direct investment, but otherwise you'll find that the Indonesian authorities tend to do what you suggested. But it's not because they don't have capital. I think it is true that there are some poor countries in the world which desperately may need capital from abroad. But if you look at the historical arguments why FDI has been encouraged in different countries, you will find that they have very little to do with the need for capital. It is often due to the fact that many of the things which we ended up producing with foreign direct investment are products where you need to do international marketing. And because we did not have the capacity to do so, we have needed the transnational companies to do that international marketing. Now, Japan found its own solution. Japan, for example, developed from the 1950s, if I'm not mistaken, something called the Sogo Soshas. The Sogo Soshas play a role of general marketing. In other words, if there are many small or medium-sized companies producing, let us say, transistor radios. That was the thing which the Japanese were producing in the 1960s. Those small companies did not have the capacity to market and sell their products. So they turned it over to these large marketing companies, the so-called Sogo Soshas, who played that kind of intermediary role. Similarly, in the case of Korea, what one finds that there are these big conglomerates which I was referring to earlier have played that kind of role. In the case of Taiwan, you don't have that kind of capacity. And in the case of China, China has been finding its way. It still is not very good at marketing Chinese products. It has some of the big companies have been able to quickly learn, and they're still finding their way around. I remember quite a number of Malaysian and other business people actually going and start developing relations with Chinese companies to do the same. There are many instances which can be cited of the potential to do more with that. So there's no single history which is the norm. Different countries in Southeast Asia, in East Asia, have innovated differently, and the same can be said in the West. Britain industrialized, England industrialized first, and the other later industrializers in continental Europe all had slightly different paths. It was not as if there is a single, pathway. And so for a third and fourth generation late industrializers, new ways and means have to be found. And this has become a big challenge. For instance, in Africa, what are you going to produce? Most external markets are already saturated. So unless you're very, very competitive, it's extremely difficult to do so. But it's not because they need capital. This idea of needing capital had a very took during the 1990s. This became very popular in some parts of the world, and stock markets were being promoted all over the world as ways of mobilizing capital. And unlike, say, Indonesia or Thailand, Malaysia was stuck in the Asian financial crisis of 97, 98, precisely because it opened up the stock market. Malaysia was very good in terms of not allowing financiers in Malaysia to borrow internationally and try to arbitrage to make money
Yes.
by borrowing cheap and then lending high. Malaysia did not allow that because of some law which was called BAFIA, the Banking and Financial Institutions Act, and so on. But it that the but precisely because it had opened up the stock market and was very keen on the stock market. Now, this was politically initially very popular because middle class people, rich people in Malaysia who had money suddenly found that the stocks they had invested in were worth even more, and they could unload their stocks and make money from that and invest in other things and so on. So it was very popular. But when the music stopped, from 95 and especially in 97, we had a very, very severe financial crisis.
Yeah,
Uh,
Prof. I would like to ask, since you mentioned when do we decide the music stops, right? You mentioned just now that capital is not necessarily an issue, but sometimes you have issues of capacity, network of selling the products that you have produced. And I would just like to go back to what Mariana Mazzucato mentioned in her book, The Entrepreneurial State. She said the government should act as mission-oriented investors, drive innovation, and be involved in the private markets. But we have seen a lot of countries doing this, Malaysia, for example, as well as the Gulf countries, where the states actually are involved in businesses as well. But I've recently read through some quarterly reports from government companies here in Malaysia that a property development company here, Prof, made 50%, almost 50% of OPEX, operating margin, when they should be supplying affordable housing, for example, if they're a government linked company, right? And there's also another GLC that I've read through that cleans and maintains golf courses in Saudi Arabia. So my question to you then, Prof, is where do we draw the line for some semblance or sanity in terms of participation in the market, especially for emerging economies?
you know, I don't think it is up to the government to tell private entrepreneurs what they want to do. If they want to, if they want to make money, getting rid of other people's shit, okay? And remember, that was a very profitable investment about 35 years ago. There was a company, Inda Water, which became very, very successful, basically providing sanitation services. Okay. So it's not for the government to go and examine the feasibility of different types of businesses and so on. But the question is, if the government is going to be providing funding, then it should do due diligence, but with different criteria than, say, the bank's due diligence. It should be making the decision whether this kind of company, this type of initiative is worth financing. Now, Mariana Mazzucato is very appropriate, but I don't think, you see, when we when we took when we discuss her moonshot and that kind of thing, she is talking basically to the big boys. She's not talking about Malaysia. She's not talking about even Indonesia. Okay? Indonesia has a population of 10 times that of Malaysia. But she's not talking about. She is talking to the US. She is talking to Europe. Europe as Europe, not Europe as Lithuania and Liechtenstein and all these other economies. She's talking to Europe as Europe. So we cannot we should not, we should be very clear about what is feasible in Malaysia. You know, in Malaysia, there's a lot of talk about how we are so wonderful in electronics. There's not a single major electronics company in the world which is owned by Malaysia. These are companies which have decided to locate in Malaysia because Malaysia offers cheap labor and decent infrastructure and cheap energy. You know, so let us be very clear. We are not we do not have any significant semiconductor manufacturing capacity or any of these other capacities. We are not there together with Taiwan or Holland or any of these countries. Okay, so but it doesn't mean that there's no room for innovation. Malaysia has done some very interesting innovation in a number of areas. I would argue, for example, that during the 1970s and 1980s, Malaysia led the world in doing refining of palm oil. Okay. And later on, that benefited many other economies, including Indonesia. And Indonesia now is doing much, much more in the palm oil space than Malaysia is. And likewise, one can mention other examples as well. The point is that I think people are picking picking and choosing whatever they want, whatever suits their particular argument, rather than looking at these proposals and these arguments in context. And there is room for Malaysia. I'll give you an example of a Malaysian company which has done very well abroad. As you know, the second largest drone manufacturer is a Malaysian-owned company. Okay, and that company didn't start off in Malaysia; it started off abroad and came back to Malaysia. Okay, that's one example. Another example is, Malaysia's oil company, Petronas, is doing a wonderful job promoting renewable energy in Vietnam. It is promoting solar panels and so on, and they're doing that in Vietnam. But they're not doing that in Malaysia. Now we have to ask ourselves the tough question, why is that happening in Vietnam and not happening in Malaysia? Okay, and it's quite a complicated answer, and that's why I'm not answering my own rhetorical question. But it reminds us that we have created our own obstacles, and sometimes they are not created by Malaysians, but they are created by the conditions in which we find ourselves. There are many things we can do. There are many things we cannot do. For example, if the U.S. president decides to do certain things, that will constrain what Malaysians can do. That will constrain what Malaysian companies can do, and or take another fact. If our neighbor offers a much lower tax rate, what is to ensure that Malaysian companies will remain in Malaysia rather than move next door and reinvest in Malaysia as a foreign direct investor, because we offer such generous incentives to foreign direct investors, and then they pay a much lower tax rate in their home country, in their new home country. Okay, and that's precisely what is being done today. We are so generous to foreign direct investors, but we do very little for our own Malaysian investors, especially the medium and smaller enterprises. So these are the kinds of inherent biases which we have in Malaysia. But I want to emphasize that that it is not as if Malaysians are incapable, but the incentive structure is such that there is very little incentive to do to undertake, for example, what DeepSeek has recently achieved. DeepSeek, is a small company, okay, and they, with relatively small amount of funds, they broke into a game which was dominated which has been dominated for years. Machine learning has been around for at least half a century. For years, it was dominated by companies which became larger and larger and larger, and size seemed to be an entry barrier. But suddenly, DeepSeek proved that they could do otherwise. It's not every day you're going to have a deep seek. But the point I want to make is that we often do not think about constraints, whether they are constraints due to national market size or other types of constraints. And it's very important for us to think about that rather than to simply, try to emulate what other people are doing without understanding or appreciating the context, whether it is an enabling context or a context which is sometimes unwittingly create posing problems.
And Professor, are you saying that the entrepreneurs should do entrepreneurship, right? In a private market where you have a problem and you try to solve that problem, try to build a business, right? But it's the government's role to sort of start thinking about the enablers of those entrepreneurial efforts, right? Whether it be access to capital, market access, and marketing, like you mentioned about, Korea, for instance, and Japan. So is that like, and what government department is that? And then, yeah, like, is that what you're saying basically? That there are some things that the government should think about, and the entrepreneurs just basically do entrepreneurship in the free market.
I think there's no simple formula, and I think it's also very important for us to recognize that you know DeepSeek,
Yeah,
probably the quarterly reports for a few years, you know, most if you use market criteria,
yeah,
nobody would have financed DeepSeek. Okay? And likewise, many other startups would never have been financed if you're looking at short-term criteria. Now, for the West, for you in California and so on, you think in terms of what kinds of possibilities are there, and the United States has been very innovative in terms of venture capital and so on and so forth. But there are problems as well. That's why, for example, Nasdaq is no longer playing the kind of dynamic role it once played. You know, and if you look at the incentives, especially the financial incentives and the financial environment, what has happened over the last 4 decades or so is very, very worrying. Once upon a time, there was a company called GE, okay? And GE was a very successful consumer manufacturing firm, consumer electrical manufacturing firm. It developed a huge reputation around the world for that. But then Mr. Welch was very successful in making it a financial conglomerate with a consumer electrical focus. And before that, or around the same time as him, actually, there was another man. His name was Kenneth Lay. Kenneth Lay did the same thing with an energy company. So Enron started off as an energy company, and later on, Enron became a financial company with an energy background. Okay, so you see the priorities shift. The priorities become increasingly financial, and financial expectations are such that unless there is it is a clearly venture capital.
hmm.
Okay, the expectations for returns are very, very quick. You will never survive on many markets. So, and think of and we're talking about the US, which has been relatively much more dynamic than, say, Europe. Think about the UK. The UK, for well over a century, has been the London was the financial capital of the world. Is it very dynamic today? Is it financing startups? No. You see, so for a startup in Taiwan, they would never dream of going anywhere. They would basically look for what they can find, you know, initially starting with family resources, and then sometimes going beyond family resources and so on. In China, what they did was they started off with what were called township and village enterprises once upon a time. at the end of the 20th century,
Mm.
you know. But
Yeah.
every if you have a responsive government, you might suggest something, let us say in the 1980s, which might be very good in the 80s and the 90s, but by become moribund by the
Yeah.
by the beginning of the 21st century. So to remain agile, to be able to continue to be relevant and innovative, but at the same time, you cannot be constantly changing the environment so much so that nobody knows what is happening. You know, everybody needs to
Yeah. A bit
have
of
certain expectations.
stability. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
100%. And in on that, basically, like there's a recent shifting of the winds, and I think you recently wrote an article about it as well. That at least in the West, this concept of an industrial policy has become very sexy now. Where before the Clinton Blair kind of era, there was more globalization, more kind of global trade, so on and so forth. Now it's more about kind of industrial policy in a way that it's almost like a form of 18th century mercantilism where you want to decrease the kind of imports and increase the exports and so on and so forth, right? What Trump is kind of doing. And trade deficits and trade deficits, that's become the thing, how to reduce trade deficits, right? Versus like a more Ricardian model, that, okay, you produce something, cheaper, I produce something cheaper, so we sort of exchange, right? So like, where do you see this kind of, firstly, what do you think of this trend that all of a sudden we're going from this free trade liberalization to this more clutch my pearls sort of key industry growth and bring onshore manufacturing back? Whereas the GEs again, where's our manufacturing capability? Yeah. So what do you sort of think of those headwinds which are sort of changing now with the new administration?
Well, I think quite honestly, it's very difficult for me to read and make sense of what the new administration is going to do. And so I would prefer not to comment on that. And certainly you living in the US are much more aware of the developments. But I would insist that industrial policy has been a feature of uh, of industrialization in almost the entire world. Okay, um, and at different times it has manifested itself differently. But if you look, for example, at the United States was crucial in terms of industrial policy uh, from the 19th century. And if the South had won the Civil War, uh, I can I can say with some degree of confidence, the U.S. would not have become the industrial power it became. If the South had won the Civil War, you
Can you
know,
explain a bit more? What do you mean by that?
well, if the South was a plantation economy, okay, the U.S. South, built on slavery, okay,
Hmm.
and the North had less, for various geographical reasons, the North was doing manufacturing, and so, I mean, it's a very long and complex argument, which requires a detailed knowledge of economic history. But there's a huge literature there now, which developing country people are looking at all the time, but which people in the West, in the rich countries, don't think about until Mr. Jake Sullivan made his speech a few years ago, legitimizing industrial policy during the Biden administration. But before that, for example, there were two central people from the former Soviet Union. I can't remember whether from Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan, Fuad and anyway, they are still working at the IMF, and they wrote a very an article about 5 years ago or maybe more, uh, talking about a policy which will not be named. Okay, that was the title. Okay, and they were referring to industrial policy. But if you look at the literature, industrial policy has been there. There's a very famous German economist named Frederick List, List. Frederick List wrote two books with almost identical titles about a decade apart. The first book was entitled Principles of the Natural Economy. Then he moved to the United States and he discovered what Alexander Hamilton had done. And Alexander Hamilton, I'm not talking about the musical, okay? But if you look at the what do you call it? Alexander Hamilton uh, uh, was, he opened up the first customs house in the southern tip of Manhattan. You will find the first customs house created in the U.S. And basically, customs and tariffs, Mr. Trump's favorite word, were already very, very crucial part. I mean, think about what the Boston Tea Party was about. Okay, so if the U.S. had developed, if the South had won the war, okay, the South would have been happy to continue to produce agricultural goods, and the South would be more like Australia today, or New Zealand today, or even Canada. Okay, it would be far, far less industrial. It was only after the North won the Civil War that you have the big boom in manufacturing, and within half a century, the US is the largest economy in the world. Okay, so I think a good economic reading of US economic history within the context of world economic history would actually emphasize how important industrial policy has been. So this myth that Ricardian, comparative advantage is the basis is actually a myth. If because it really comes out of the fact that during World War II, as you know, the Europe was destroyed. Okay, the Nazis destroyed much of London, much of the UK. And the targets were not the farms. The targets were the industrial cities. So if you look at, say, Warwick, the University of Warwick, Coventry was flattened, but the Nazi planes could not fly further north. So they couldn't make it all the way to Glasgow, and they couldn't destroy the industry of Glasgow. So suddenly, Glasgow, which was so far north and was considered so cold and so on, suddenly became important again for the Royal Navy in terms of, I mean, I'm getting into all kinds of military and other history, but the point I'm trying to make really is that, industrial capacity was destroyed, and there was an American Treasury Secretary, Mr. Morgenthau. Okay, he's related to the Morgenthaux who control the New York Times. Okay, Mr. Morgenthau actually wrote and published a book in 1944. In those days, even though you're Treasury Secretary, you actually write books. And he argued that Germany had started and was responsible for both the First and Second World War. And Germany was a country which you give them an industrial capacity and they will start a war. That was Morgenthau's argument. So as far as Morgenthau was concerned, we have to deindustrialize Germany. We have to transform Germany into a pastoral economy. But how many people can you support with that pastoral economy? Germany at that time had about 25 million people. You can't support 25 million people on economy of Heidi, running around the Alps and with a few cows and all that. You have to have industry becomes extremely important. So and Keynes everybody talks about the general theory, but very few people actually read it. But his first book was called The Economic Consequences of the Peace. Okay, and what was he referring to? He was referring to the treaty which was negotiated in the Versailles Palace, just south of Paris, to conclude World War One. And what did he say? The economic consequences of the peace. He said the way you are treating Germany is going to create problems. And he was so right. Within less than a decade, the conditions were being created for World War II.
Prof, I would like to ask regarding what we've discussed so far, which is we talk about industrialization, we talk about private markets, and we talk about the implications of industrialization in historical times. But I would like to bring back the discussion into what's happening in the emerging markets when beyond all those economic indicators, Acevoglu and James Robinson argue that what's more also important would be strong institutions, the rule of law, and a more inclusive development. But we have seen that despite peace post-colonial periods, especially in certain regions in Africa, they're still stuck in a vicious cycle where they're not able to recover from the post-colonial impact of that has caused problems, challenges in their developmental period. So they the leaders of these countries would often go back and blame the colonial masters for the deficiencies that they have structurally, and hence not being able to take it forward for them to develop a more sustained development. What's your comment on that when leaders kept on going back to the colonial times for them to um, use as an excuse of not being able to develop as well as some other nations, Prof?
Well, Hafizi, I'm afraid they're wrong. Okay, just because he get the Nobel Prize doesn't make them correct. There was a man who got the Nobel Prize in 19 what year was it? And then within a few months, his whole model, uh, the asset, what was it called? Black-Scholes model. Okay, the whole model collapsed. LTCM, Long-Term Capital Management Company, collapsed, and that was the end of it. And I mean, there have been many other instances. Look at what happened when the Nobel Committee gave the Nobel Prize to Barack Obama, or to Abe in Ethiopia. Within less than a year, they both started wars. Okay, so what does the Nobel Prize tell us? Okay, you give a Nobel Prize for peace, you get a war. Okay, so I don't want to say that there's a simple mechanical thing, but my problem with Daron Acemoglu, because he's Turkish, right? And Wahid, I'm not sure which country you're from, but I think the Turkish pronounce the name that way. Okay, the other two, James Robinson and Simon Simon Johnson. They're all of they're the two of them are personal friends of mine. Okay, they're both Englishmen who have made it. They have been very successful in the UK. And Simon Johnson got tenure, and he became a professor on using the data which you might have seen, about the companies the groupings which emerged during the 1990s in Malaysia. Now, the basic argument why I say it's wrong, because their argument is that what you need is settler colonialism. Okay, think about it. You go through the argument, and what they are saying is that settler colonialism, which is basically what you had in Australia, New Zealand, the US, Canada, is basically what it takes. Okay, and this is, in a way, a more sophisticated economic justification for the argument which people like Sam Huntington made in the early 1990s. Huntington, if you remember, was arguing against his former student, Francis Fukuyama, who said there was the end of history. We now have the triumph of liberal capitalism, and we will have eternal peace. Instead, it was the unipolar moment, and we know that we have had more wars in the period since then than you had before that. Okay, so Huntington was wrong, but Huntington created these new cultural categories. For him, the West had to be divided between the Catholics and the what he created called the Judeo-Christian civilization. Now, if you go to anywhere in the world except in the United States, nobody knows what a Judeo-Christian civilization is. The Judeo-Christian civilization is an American post-war American intervention. Okay, so why does now Latin America is also the result of settler colonialism? It didn't quite work. Southern Africa has had a long history of settler colonialism. It resulted in the last parts of the world to end colonialism were South Africa, and before that Zimbabwe. All due to settler colonialism. So there's a good book by Mahmoud Mamdani of Columbia University where he discusses some of these issues, and I'm not going to try to summarize these things. But the point I'm trying to make is their argument is essentially that what you need really are the conditions created by Anglo settler colonialism, not Spanish, Latin American, Latin settler colonialism, or Southern Africa, where you have the native community being quite significant. You can get away with it in Australia because you basically wipe out all the Aboriginal people, or you continue to suppress them as in other places. And I would argue the same thing is true in West Asia.
Yeah.
So
But Prof, how do we explain the situation where a lot of these poor nations are actually also are inheriting the remnants or the remains of the colonial masters, right? Of the UK, for example. But if your argument is that they insist that you have a settler colonialism for you to be successful, but didn't these countries also inherit that system? Aren't they also resource rich, and some of them are
no, no,
populous nations as well? But how come they're stuck in that cycle where they kept on failing in terms of fulfilling or meeting the governance standards of the developing or developed countries? How do you explain that, Prof?
no. I'm sorry, Hafizi, I'm not clear enough. I have not. Malaysia was not settler colonial. Okay, Malaysia was just colonial. Okay, and Malaysia was the richest colony in the whole in the British Empire in the 20th century. Malaysia contributed more to the sterling currency zone in the 5 years from 1946 to 1951 than the rest of the British Empire put together. Malaysia contributed almost 70%. Okay, partly is because of the Korean War. The price of tin and the price of rubber went up. What did the UK have? The UK was bombed out, so they were desperately trying to rebuild. Okay, and but even before that, if you look at the book of Sultan Nazrin of Perak, he has got a book, economic history book, and he shows how profitable Perak especially, but the whole of Malaya was for the British. So we were very, very profitable. We could be, if we kept our wealth rather than give it up to Britain, we would be a much, much richer country today. We could afford a much higher standard of living. Now, if you look at the Gulf states, the Gulf states were at that time when Britain ruled, they were considered so poor that Britain didn't even send their British officials there. They ruled the Gulf from the India office. Okay, they ruled the Gulf from the India office. That's why people can argue quite legitimately that the Indians in the Gulf states have a long history. Okay, of course, it is greatly exaggerated because many of them want to go in. But if you look at the wealth, I mean, you look at the Arsenal football stadium. Who paid for it? Emirates.
Emirates. Yeah.
Yeah. You see, the point is that, but that is not settler colonialism. Settler colonialism is when the people from the mother country go, right? And it also happened in Latin America and so on. You take the Philippines, okay? It was supposed to be it was a colonial country, but I wouldn't say it's a settler colonial country. How many Spanish actually settled there? Very
Yeah.
few. Very few, and they constitute the elite. But by and large, it was the native people. And ironically, because of the Acapulco connection with Manila, there were actually more Mexicans who stayed in the Philippines than Spanish people. So the point is that settler colonialism is a very special subset of colonialism, and this is, I think, something which they
Yeah.
don't even think in those terms.
I think, by the way, James Robinson, professor, was on this podcast before he got the Nobel Prize, actually. But well, from what I can remember, I think the argument they were making was not just settler colonialism, but there's something about extractive institutions that are from the colonial past that are kept, and those extractive sort of institutions versus the good one, which is the inclusive institutions, is what makes a huge difference in where the country goes next, right? I think that was the main thing, and I think they may have the statistics that basically Anglo institutions were much better compared to, say, like Francophone institutions, which are much more extractive. So if you look at the Francophile countries right now, they're much poorer compared to the Anglo-spheric countries, basically, that were there. So yeah, I don't know what you basically think about that distinction between extractive versus inclusive institutions per se.
I complete, I mean, there are differences among the three of them, okay?
Yeah,
And as I said, they are personal friends, so I'm not, don't particularly want to get into a
yeah, we'll have a
personal,
debate with you guys properly,
a personal criticism, yeah.
Yeah,
But I think it's important for, if you look, they, of course, they don't they don't talk about it using the same terms I'm using. They don't
I
talk
see.
about settler colonialism, okay?
Sure, sure.
I'm
Yeah.
describing it because what they basically are implying is settler colonialism.
Hmm.
Okay. And today, especially after what happened in Gaza over the last year and a half, nobody wants to be associated with settler colonialism anymore. Okay. But I think it is important to recognize that it is the same phenomenon at work. You see? Because the whole creation of Israel is a very recent creation of Israel, of a country, okay, and of a nation, and is a nation created at the expense of other people, because you basically build on the same myth as Australia was, that it is a land without people for a people without land. Okay, that's
Hmm.
the myth of Israel, and is the myth of what happened with Australia. There was supposedly nobody there, you know. But anyway, coming back, I think you make the point very quite correctly that there has been extractive colonialism, and undoubtedly that has been very, very important difference, and I completely agree with that part of the argument. But as Leon Ndikumana has shown in his work on Africa, it is extraction in itself is happening all the time. I mean, if you think about what the US has become, the US wants to sell its drill baby drill. What do you think drill baby drill is about? It is about extractive economy. So the US is regressing into becoming much more of an extractive economy, and wants to become much more of an extractive economy. And it is not extraction in and of itself. but it is the terms and conditions under which extraction take place. So if you are extracting and producing gold, for example, you could become pretty rich, right?
Hmm.
Or if you're extracting and producing oil, especially after the 1970s, you could make a lot of money.
Hmm.
Okay, I mean, look at where the Saudi wealth come from. You know, it's Aramco, right? So I think, but I think there is a point that just becoming rich on a bit of on some mineral extraction, or as in the case of Sarawak in Malaysia, of cutting down the trees, that itself is a one-shot wealth booster for whoever gets the wealth.
Hmm. Yeah.
In that case, the wealth went off to other countries, to Canada, to Australia, and so on and so forth. It did not stay. It did not contribute to developing the people of Sarawak. Okay, so I think it's important to recognize that what happens to that wealth makes a huge difference. Many people, and it's really how that wealth is deployed, which made a difference. The problem with Angola is not that oil was sold. The problem with Angola was that the president's daughter was taking the money out of the country, you
Yeah.
know, and so on. So I think we have to be very careful here about what the problem is, because there are still many, many extractive economies, and there are many developing countries who have nothing else which is appreciated in the world economy today other than its mineral wealth. The,
Yeah. Yeah.
the question then is, how do we get the most out of it, and how it is invested productively?
Yeah. That makes sense. Really, that makes sense. Sorry, Sfizi, do you want to come in for
Yeah,
something or?
I know it's very late now, Prof, but I would just like to ask a parting question. Considering into talking about emerging economies and the struggles of post-colonial periods, right? There is an argument, especially by Easterly and the Bisa Moyo, that foreign aid has not been particularly useful in helping some of these countries to prop up their development, because it's often guzzled by state leaders, for example, or the institutions which have failed. What's your comment on that, especially in the context of Trump pulling out funding for US aid, which has impacted some operations in Africa, particularly? Maybe a quick comment on that, Prof.
Both of you have done your homework. Excited to be with you, all, both of you. But let's face it, we wrote the stuff in the 1970s, which they started writing about in at the beginning of this century. Okay, I cannot disagree with them that aid has been used to control people. Okay. And earlier, Wahid, I didn't fully answer your question, but what you said about francophone, the francophone system. In fact, I wrote an article about this with Dongo Sambasila of Senegal about a month ago, where basically it's called an exorbitant privilege for all. And exorbitant privilege here refers to what the French president said about the US. Okay, that the US can just issue US dollars and everybody else accepts it, right? And it gives them a certain privilege. So the French were complaining about the US, but the French were doing exactly the same thing with its former colonies in the 14 countries which use the CFA, right? So what James Robinson was saying is absolutely correct, but you don't need his big argument to fall back on that. But coming back to Hafiz's point, um, it is true that aid has been used, okay, but it is it's aid has been abused like anything for decades and decades. But at the same time, for countries with next to no resources, okay, it has often been very important. I'll give you an example of why international cooperation is very useful. Recently, the former president of the US, Jimmy Carter, died. Okay. In 1979, I think, at the World Health Organization, which of course the US has withdrawn from recently again, at the World Health Organization, the Soviet Union challenged the US. Let us work together to get rid of smallpox. And Jimmy Carter, the president of the US, accepted the challenge. And together, the Soviet Union and the US helped and to work together. And within a decade, smallpox was history. It remains in two places, I think. One, I think, is in northern Nigeria, in the Hausa area. There are some people who refuse to be vaccinated against smallpox. And I think in some place in Afghanistan as well, there are pockets where smallpox still exists. But for the rest of the world, smallpox is gone. Okay? This is what came about due to cooperation. There's so much good which can come about through cooperation. The kind of competition, dog eat dog type of competition which exists today, is not going to achieve very much. And it's all basically self-interested. And as I suggested earlier, the whole process of financialization has distorted incentives. For example, during the last decade, there was a lot of, thanks to QE, quantitative easing, there was a lot of money available at very low cost. Okay, and you could have done a lot of things with that, and many the poor countries started borrowing money. Then, about 3 years ago, the 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 US started raising interest rates. Why? Because of inflation. What caused that inflation? That inflation has largely been caused by supply side disruptions. For example, you kick the Soviet Union, you kick Russia of uh, out of the what do you call it, the payment system. You confiscate their money and so on and so forth. So basically, they're not going to do very much. Before that, of course, the pandemic was also causing a lot of problems. Shipping arrangements were disrupted and so on and so forth. So it is supply side factors which were largely responsible for the increase in prices. Okay. And how do you expect a demand side measure by raising interest rates to address a supply side problem? When you have a supply side problem, you address the supply side problem. You do not, it is like you have brain cancer and you start fiddling around on your toes. I mean, that's basically what the Fed was recommending. And this obsession with 2%, where does it come from? It came about, we wrote about this a few years ago. It came about because in 1989, the the finance minister of New Zealand, okay, the smallest country in the rich world, okay, the finance minister of New Zealand was politically ambitious. He wanted to capture the imagination of the public by bringing down inflation, and he asked the central bank governor, what would it work to say that by this was 1989, okay, in 3 years, by 1992, he would bring down inflation to 2. Why? Because he liked the sound of the slogan 2 by 92. Okay, that is the origin of the 2% thing. Now, when Mr. Jerome Powell claims that this is a 2% thing which the whole world has agreed on and so on and so forth, he is basically, well, let me be polite and okay.
Yeah.
Basically, these are all myths. Okay, 2 by 92 was invented by that ambitious politician after he consulted his governor of the New Zealand Reserve Bank, and they agreed on 2% being a reasonable. And now it is talked about. You can never find. I challenge you to find any economic paper, okay, which justifies this 2% offset thing by 92. When I was a student, they were even talking about low double-digit inflation being acceptable. Okay, that means like 12% is okay. 12%, okay? And now they're talking about 2% as if it is a God-given number. So you have a lot of mythology, and that's why it's very important for people to speak the truth. You need
Yeah.
whistleblowers in the economics profession, to, to,
Yeah.
to expose a lot of this mythology, you know.
Yeah, just to highlight on that, Professor. So, how do you? So, if you're saying that it's a supply side problem, but you're trying to solve it through the demand side, how do you explain the fact that what the Fed is doing and what the Bank of England is doing is actually working, which is increase interest rate, and now inflation has come down in the UK, for instance, right? And then now they're cutting interest rates, basically. So, how do you sort of explain that?
Wahid, it will work. You take away money from people, or it costs more to spend, or it costs more to invest. What do you expect to happen? People will spend less.
Okay. Okay.
The point is that is it an appropriate solution to a problem?
Okay. Okay. So, but if you're to solve the core problem of supply side, what would you do now, basically?
I would address the problems. Okay, the pandemic, of course, is over, but the changes in shipping arrangements are not over. The sanctions have basically been very disruptive, and then you have policies such as what was it called? What reshoring
Yeah.
and then friendshoring. These are all
Yeah.
supply side disruptions. We in Southeast Asia, Hafizi knows this very well. We in Southeast Asia, our number one trading partner is China. What are you going to tell us to do? To stop buying things from China? To refuse to trade with China?
Mm.
You know, I mean, you are basically you're not on, and it's not just Malaysia. The number two trading partner of all of Latin America is China. The number one trading partner of most countries in Africa is also China. Okay, the number one trading partner of India is China. Okay, so it. I mean, this new anti-globalization thing is really about China. I mean, you know. So the question is whether you want to have a series of closed economies. You know, all those people who used to be, globalizers. What has happened to them? You know. Now, I the fact you can bring down the temperature of a sick person by putting the person in ice water, you know. But
Yeah.
is that going to solve the source of the fever?
Mm.
You know,
Yeah. So, does that mean if there's a systemic issue with protectionism and closing down free trade, are we in for an era of forever rising inflation all over the world and so on and so forth? Is it, what does that mean basically?
um,
Because
not not not,
it
not
will be
really.
much more expensive, right? If you're based in the US and you want a piece of cloth, but now Trump is putting tariffs basically on stuff coming from China, um, and you're producing it locally, which costs like 2x, 3x now, it will eventually be passed down to the consumers, like you and me, right? And if every country starts doing this, I wonder if we're just should have that baseline expectation that everything is going to be much more expensive now.
It would be more expensive for you, Wahid, but not for Hafizi and me.
I see.
Okay,
Okay.
okay, because I think you see now, Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, she was as anti-China as you could be 6 months ago. Okay, when she was re-elected for her second term, she was basically talking about, a new North Atlantic alliance, blah blah blah. Okay, look at the new rhetoric, it's slowly changing. It's not going to change overnight. And many things are going to take a lot of time. It's not even very clear what's happening. But you can see also Mr. Trump is half the time one doesn't know whether he's saying things for effect, he's saying things to test the water, or
Or
whether
to make a deal. Yeah.
yeah, or is he using it as a bargaining chip. That's why I hesitate to say what is US policy.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It
Yeah.
is so tempting to jump on one or two things and
Yeah.
to presume that that's policy for the next 4 years.
There is this quote that take Trump seriously, but not literally, you know?
Yeah,
Because like he says a lot of things, but doesn't end up doing it. Yeah.
well, Mr. Kissinger said
Yeah.
it is very dangerous to be an ally of the US. It is fatal to be it is fatal to no, sorry. It, it is it is dangerous well, it's fatal to be an ally.
And enemy.
No, fatal to be an ally.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, you get the
Yeah.
quote from Kissinger.
Yeah.
Poor man is gone and so on. But
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of these people say things, which are very quotable, right?
Yeah.
No,
100%.
frankly, I'm very worried. But if you look at Mrs. Dr. Kristalina Georgieva, the managing director of the IMF, if you look at the IMF's, the IMF comes out with things every day, right? Most of them don't make nobody reads them half the time, but I do read them. And she is basically warning that the world is going to remain in stagnation, not inflation. Frankly, I don't think inflation is going to be the biggest problem.
I see.
We are going to have stagnation unless we find growth. Well, stagnation for the rest of us. China is growing at 5+%. Okay. So Biden, Trump have all succeeded in slowing down China. But they did it by slowing down the rest of us too, including themselves. You see? You know what I mean? So, you remember in the old days, China was growing at 8%, and they said, no, we have to do something about it. We have to cut them down. So China announced that they are now growing at about 5%, 5 plus. Okay? So, yeah, you have succeeded in slowing down China. But at what expense? It's not just us in the developing world who are worried. Okay? And Malaysia is relatively well off. Okay? You go to Africa. I've just come back from Africa recently. It's in many countries are in bad shape. Okay? Very bad shape. Latin America, there's no growth prospects on the horizon. Okay, I'm not sure about the Middle East and so on, but people are very, very, very worried, and because nobody knows where growth is, and the head of the IMF is saying the same thing. Okay, it's not often that I agree with the head of the IMF, but on this I definitely think she's quite right, and so we have a situation, an avoidable situation, where we are creating the conditions for the world slowing down. And that is very, very worrying.
Yeah. And just to sort of last question, just to wrap it off on that note, like there's something about technology increasing the TFP, the total factor of productivity, and unleashing growth, basically, right? We saw it happen with the Industrial Revolution. We saw it happen with the internet. A lot of the countries, including like in the East as well, Singapore and so on and so forth, certainly in the UK and the US, are betting on artificial intelligence or AI as that sort of thing to increase productivity, increase growth. So just to wrap things off, do you see AI and that kind of technology unleashing that kind of growth basically as a potential?
Okay. I'm sorry. Although I stopped teaching economics more than two
Yeah,
decades ago, I cannot help but,
yeah,
but get the economics right. Okay.
sure.
The problem with TFP, how do you get the TFP numbers, right? You get the TFP numbers by looking at how much productivity increases then you minus what is due to capital and you minus what is due to labor. Okay? And the residual is what you call TFP. Okay? The problem is that most of the time we don't measure either capital or labor very correctly. Hafizi will tell you that there are a few million foreigners in Malaysia, and our official statistics pretend they are not here.
3 million maybe.
Huh?
3 million of them maybe.
No, the official, the minister of human resources in 2014, he asked the telcos, the telephone companies, to estimate the number of foreigners, and they came up with a figure of 6.7 million. At that time, the official number we were acknowledged was 2.2 million. The difference was 4.5 million. In other words, 2/3 were not acknowledged,
I
1/3
see.
was acknowledged. Okay.
Mm.
Today, some people say the situation is worse, but I don't have any estimate, so I won't say anything, right? But the point is, when you have 4.5 million people, if you use the 2014 number, or possibly more, out of a labor force where the number of Malaysians is about 15 million at most. Okay, that's a lot of people. And then so your labor productivity numbers are gone. And how do you measure labor productivity? Okay, according to conventional economic theory, you measure productivity by the so-called marginal productivity, right? But in fact, we keep the wages down. And how is marginal productivity measured? It is by the marginal wage. Okay, we suppress the wages by bringing in foreign workers. Okay, so the result is that our labor productivity numbers are huge underestimates.
I see.
Okay? Yeah, so I think we have a problem that we do not. But your point is basically correct. Your point is that what is likely to happen with increases in productivity, and there's a huge potential. As I said, machine learning, one type, the traditional type of AI, has been around for half a century. Okay, it's been around for half a century, and I don't think I have the capacity to imagine what more can be done. But the question is, who benefits from it?
Yeah,
If
true.
DeepSeek pushes the whole thing, the prices will go down. If somebody else is capturing it, doing the most of the innovation, the prices are going to go up, right? So
Correct. Yeah.
the distributional consequences are very great. So you could well have, as with earlier automation, we could have a lot of people out of jobs, or you could well have that benefiting humanity in tremendous ways. Okay, but it is not going to be measured in terms of somebody getting wealth, somebody becoming a billionaire. You could, for example, make much more accurate prescriptions. Like I'm probably 1.5 times your weight. Okay, I'm 189 centimeters tall. Okay, I'm 1.5 times your weight. The kind of medicine I would need, given my age, etc., would be very different from what Havizi needs and what you would need, right? So we can get prescription medicines which are very, 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 very appropriate for us. We could basically identify those things in our prescriptions which do not have side effects. Okay, and so on and so forth. So the potential is tremendous. But how do you measure something like that which is not monetized? If your mother lives longer, how is that measured? That all these things are very, very difficult to measure because we are now so accustomed to to measuring everything in terms of money. You know,
Yeah.
I wrote an article last week or 2 weeks ago about children I was studying almost half a century ago. Children from rice growing villages whose parents were very, very poor. They were earning in those days 250 ringgit, about $100, okay, per month, yeah, on average. The rubber smallholders were earning 350 ringgit, about 40% more, okay. But the children of the rice growers were much healthier. Why? Because they were catching and eating fish in the canals, in the rice canals. You know, and those fish are so small that you eat the whole fish, bones and all.
Mm.
So you get a bit of fish protein, you get calcium. Okay? So when you're measuring your upper arm girth, okay,
Mhm.
which is what you do when you're trying to look at children, the nutrition, you find that their upper arm girth is much wider than you know. So you know that kind of so here you have the poorer child being better off. Okay.
Interesting.
So I think it's very important to recognize that our well-being is not completely monetizable, you know,
Mm. True.
and this will pose increasing challenges when we think in terms of well-being, you know, rather than in terms of you know of other of how much money you have, you know,
True.
and
True.
this, you know, it might undermine your program, but
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
but you know, it is a very, very important thing in terms of the future of humanity.
Yeah. No, no, that makes sense, really. But thank you, Professor Jomo, for your time. I feel like we can go on forever if we wanted to, because it's such an interesting conversation. But really appreciate your time coming on the show today, and thank you very much.
You're most
Sure.
welcome.
Thank you,
Okay,
Prof.
have
And
easy.
selamat
Bye.
berpuasa.